Now, I got my information, as I said, from the National Archives, and I spent about 60 days there over 10 years, and I copied 6 foot of documents in one record group, and that was 25 cents a page. It was $40 an inch, and that was on my dime as a community college professor. So I remained broke until I retired. So I would go in from the back. This is a big building, and it has all the government records, and it's full now, so they have other buildings, and they've sent them out also. They're in all the states too. But the main National Archives building, the researchers would come in from the back, not where you take tours, and I would see this as I would wait for the National Archives to open, and the voice, study the past is what it's about. And here's another one. The heritage of the past is the seed that brings forth the harvest of the future. Those are 2 sayings in the National Archives building. And my favorite, what is past is prologue. George Santayana said, if we can't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it. My main source of information in the National Archives, as I said, came from Indian depredation claims. They're a little known group. They're not on microfilm. They're not, you have to go visit. In the National Archives, in these Indian depredation claims, one record group alone houses 12,000 individual claims. The claims contain fascinating first-hand accounts, and that's where I found the Fletcher story. This goes way back. Look at the Rocky Mountain News for March 2nd, 1866. Down in the bottom right corner is highlighted here. Attorneys, and no negative things to attorneys that are here. They're always trying to get business drummed up, right? So they're trying to get people to make claims against the government for bounty, petitions and back pay for due soldiers, and also for depredations committed by Indians in Colorado and neighboring territories. Let me say another thing about the depredation claims before I get into the Cheyenne treaties. Congress established this law for compensation for American citizens if they get attacked and have property stolen or destroyed by Indians who are in treaty with the United States and receiving assistance. And you had 3 years to make your claim. Otherwise, it was thrown out. You had to be an American citizen. So many of the people on the trails, you know, were not necessarily American citizens. They were coming out. They applied their papers, but they hadn't been finalized and that sort of thing. And that was with the Fletcher family. They came from England. And so their claim was denied because they weren't American citizens. But then in 1885, Congress redefined the depredation claims rules, and they opened it up for anyone who had been attacked by Indians. They removed the 3-year clause and they removed the citizenship clause, and over 6,000 claims came in from the Indian War era that I write about in the 1860s on refiles, and the Fletchers refiled again. One of the requirements that they had is that of course you had to list the value of the property lost, and you had to have affidavits from other people who could prove that you had suffered this. So sometimes they would include in their files newspaper articles. They'd ask the soldiers who came and assisted them to support them and write a report about what happened. And you got a lot of that with the Julesburg raids and all that, where the people that are known in Eugene Ware, and they're mentioned in Eugene Ware's Indian War of 1864, they're making statements, affidavits to help a settler because they came upon them or assisted them in some way. So you have that. There was no compensation for injury or death. There was no compensation for lost labor. So a freighter who owned his wagon and was going to get paid once he delivered his goods to Denver from St. Joe and gets attacked at the Plum Creek Massacre can only make a claim for his wagon. If he's killed, his widow can make a claim for what his supplies were that there, but all of the rest of that stuff that he's carrying, that's the claim made by the merchant in Denver who lost that. There was nothing for captivity suffering or injuries or that sort of thing. But it's those affidavits that are so interesting. And of course, you just can't rely on the affidavits alone, like a court trial. You get someone up there to testify under oath. That's what an affidavit is. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? And if you study as rut nuts, you know that these settlers and these people back then, that meant a lot to them that it doesn't mean to us today. But that was a very important. Now, the treaties start as we took one of the tours, the Horse Creek Treaty, the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, and you see in the big blue right here, all of this. This is Casper, Wyoming, roughly right there at the top. That's the North Platte River as it goes down here and joins with the South Platte and goes through Nebraska. And then you come down to the bottom here and you get clear down here, you get the Arkansas River as it flows into Kansas. And that was the whole area that was given to the Cheyenne and Arapaho in the 1851 treaty. Of course, at this time, nobody was settling here, but the Overland Trail is going, the Oregon Trail, the California Trail. And so one of the agreements is that they let the people pass through and not harm them. And that you can have, that's your hunting area, that's all of yours. That's a huge area, isn't it? But the biggest thing that brought about the Indian War, in my opinion, that started in 1864, and it started before Sand Creek. And let's get that straight, because we've heard a lot of talks, and we've seen, we think that everything started with the Sand Creek Massacre. As you saw with the presentation of the cousins, this started in August. That was 3 months before the Sand Creek Massacre. They had gone to war, and there's plenty of evidence for it. But once gold was discovered in 1858, and the rush was on in 1859, and Denver's founded, and they're all going up into the mining camps. They're taking the South Platte River into Denver and going from there, and that is destroying everything that the Indians. Their whole culture was about. They followed the buffalo. That's why they were down by Fort Union too. They were also, but they had to have their food. And the buffalo migrates seasonally from Texas actually all the way up to Canada. And they're, the Indians, the Cheyenne, their roaming range is roughly the Sweetwater in Texas, all the way down there, a little bit further south, all the way up through Montana. And so they would follow the buffalo. Well, what's happening with all these freighters coming in? They're bringing in all of these mules and all of this cattle and everything, and these water courses are quickly eaten up. Many depredation claims talk about the depredations happening when they go into camp. And it doesn't matter if it's the North Platte or the South Platte or the Arkansas, they're going into camp in Smoky Hill, but they have to go at least 3 miles outside of camp with their herders to get grazing for their cattle, or for their oxen, or for their mules. And so it was all eaten up. The trees were cut down, the limited trees. There were groves of trees, like big timbers that was mentioned many times, where there might be 40 miles on the Arkansas Santa Fe Trail of timber. Now it's 30, now so it's gonna be 20, it's getting shrunk. And no wood around anywhere. There was what they called one lone tree, somewhere in Colorado, after about half of Nebraska, on the Platte. But so with all of this coming in, they knew the conflict was inevitable, and this was an environmental issue more than anything else, because we had upset the nomadic lifestyle unintentionally. We got that land. Some of it was purchased from France. Some of it was won in a war with Mexico, and so it was theirs that we got from them. And the Indians had also taken that land by conquest. And something that a lot of people don't know is the area of the contested plains here in the Central Plains. The Cheyenne had only taken that land from the others that had been there for centuries, for only about 40 years before the Sand Creek Massacre. And the decimation of the buffalo also was caused more by the Indians themselves in their trade with the fur traders. In that Horse Creek Treaty, as early as 1851, it was known that the buffalo was going to only be around for about another generation. That's about 20 years. In 1868 and 69, in the Indian raids in the middle of Kansas, the settlers that could settle there with the Homestead Act could go 2 or 3 miles to shoot buffalo. By 1873, the last buffalo was killed in that whole area of Kansas. But it was started with the fur traders getting the buffalo robes, and the Indians spending their time killing the buffalo to get the goods that they wanted from us. They loved what they got there. They got the ammunition, they got the sugar, they got the food, they got all of the tins and the guns and the beads and the iron arrow points. So you don't have to make arrow points. At the Battle of Summit Springs in 1869, in the inventory of the village, at only 84 lodges, there were counted 4,000 manufactured iron arrow points in trade, made in Philadelphia. So they liked what we brought them, but it was changing things and conflict was inevitable. So we tried to fix that with the Treaty of Fort Wise, which became the Fort Lyon Treaty, or it was at Fort Wise, which became Fort Lyon because Wise resigned from the Union Army to join the Confederacy. And so they renamed Fort Wise Fort Lyon for the first officer killed in the war. I think it was a guy that tried to take a flag down off of a tavern that was a Confederate flag. And that was, I think, Nathaniel Lyon, and it was Colonel Lyon anyway. So they named Fort Lyon after him in honor of him. But if you look at the treaty that they signed in that, it's in the dark blue at the corner there, right in there. And I kind of measured that's about 1/16th, 1/15th of their entire area that they had in 1851. They gave that up for 1/16th of that. They were allowed to continue to hunt the buffalo, and there were things made, to leave the settlers alone, stay 10 miles away from settlements and things like that. Report yourself to the post that you're hunting in this area where there's civilization, and you can continue. But it didn't work out that way. And then the war began before St. Creek. The war began, if you want to call it, with Grattan and the fight at the Little Blue in 1865. And then with up in Minnesota in August, in about a 3-week period of 1862, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs for those Indians up north, the Northern Lakota, said that there were just under 700 settlers killed in a 3-week period, most of them women and children. Now, there was punitive expeditions against them in 1863 and 1864, and they were chased out of that area, and by late 1862, those Northern Lakota were smoking the war pipe with the Southern Lakota and the Arapaho and the Cheyenne. And then they agreed to wait until there was enough ammunition and arms in trading to be friendly, and then we'll break out this war. And they knew that was going to happen in the summer of '64. They were stealing stock, but they weren't killing people. The Hungate family was killed June 11th, 1864, about 30 miles southeast of Denver. But that wasn't cause to start the war. The depredation claims filed by the settlers, where over 400 stock was stolen around the Hungate family, showed that people were not injured at all in the theft of the stock. The Hungate family was killed because Nathan Hungate shot an Indian stealing stock the day before, and they came out and burned the cabin down the next day, killed him. That's chapter 1 of my new book. That goes against the traditional story about that Nathan was away from his family and saw his cabin in flames and tried to come back to assist them. So anyway, by 1867, we get in the fall of '67, the Medicine Lodge Treaty, south of Great Bend, maybe about 60 miles, Great Bend, Kansas. And then it was in that, when they were waiting for their annuities and the approval of Congress, that they finally got their guns and broke out with Indian raids in Kansas that were very deadly in August of 1868, and it resulted in the death of Black Kettle at the Battle of Washita on November 27th that year. And still the Cheyenne resisted and made another raid into Kansas and captured a young mother and her daughter and another woman, and killed the children and killed the little daughter they took. And then they got caught at Summit Springs near Sterling, Colorado on July 11th, 1869, and Tall Bull was killed, and that basically ended that Central Plains Indian War. But you can see with the treaties and all that we're trying to remove them more and more away from the settlers. And then this is the same map that the cousins used, and I sent it to them. This was a map that I had in Cheyenne War, a fold-out map. That's why there's a line in the middle. And I had traced all of the stage stops and ranches on the Platte and into Colorado, and then the South Platte into Denver, and also put out where all this stuff happened. Now, if you look at Wyoming up on the left, This is where we're going to get the, where it is, up by here, I think it is. It's about there where we're going to have the Fletchers captured in 1865. A little background on the Cheyenne, I'll be quick on this. They really were up in Minnesota, and they lived in huts, and they they were not nomadic. But they changed, and they decided in the late 1600s that they wanted to follow the buffalo, and they gave up the huts and growing crops and that sort of thing, and began to gradually work their way down into the Central Plains, fighting Indians all the way or making alliances with Indians. They made alliance with the Lakota, but they didn't with the Crow and the Arikari and the many others, and especially when they get down into the central part of the plains, the Pawnee and the Utes and the Oto. In the Potawatomi. I mean, it was a warfare all the way until I could defeat you or I could alliance with you. And as I had said, they had not been here very long, only about 20 years before the Sand Creek Massacre. As I said about the causes for the Cheyenne War, I've already listed it all. You know, I talked with a historian, an Arapaho, up at the Wind River Reservation, and he's a tribal liaison historian, really nice guy, John Ratcliffe, and I asked him, I said, you know, it's a warring tribe. I mean, they were all warring tribes, and you can accept defeat when you've been defeated. You have to, you know. What did the government do that hurt your culture the worst? You know what that was? That was a cultural extermination of the children after they were put on reservations. That's the worst thing that the United States ever did to hurt the Indians. And there's many things about that to understand. The Indians believe, especially the Cheyenne, but the Northern Arapaho too, and the Shoshone admitted this also, but said not everybody, but it's this. They make prayers to their ancestors. Their oral history is important to them because they share those stories of their ancestors that way. They can't make prayers to their ancestors except in the language the ancestors can understand. And so to wipe out their learning the language and that sort of thing was really, really, that was a big thing for Wounded Knee and all that. We heard the earlier talk about it. It was more about their seeing that their culture is being destroyed with what's happening to their children. John Ratcliffe shared a story about his grandfather. I think it was his grandfather, he said, was sent to the agency to check on mail when he was 5 years old. And he didn't come home for 5.5 years. He was picked up by the government, and he was sent to a boarding school in Oregon. There was no communication with the parents about it. And then let's get the beginning of this, which is pre-Sand Creek. Late in August, George Bent writes, while the young men were still busy raiding on the Platte, the chiefs called a council. It was decided to write to the authorities, ask for peace, and offer to give up the white prisoners who had been captured during the raids. So after the raids of August 7th and 8th, and that carried on, and you understand that on June 27th, Governor Evans sent out a proclamation asking all the Indians, and he sent them through his agents to them all, and said, those that want to be friendly, come into your agencies. And they had assigned agencies. And those that don't will be considered hostile. And that was just after the Hungate Massacre. We hadn't had the outbreak at the Little Blue in Plum Creek yet. That's another month and a half away. So, but they didn't come in. And Governor Evans even pleaded with Black Kettle to meet with him and had an arranged place to meet, and Black Kettle refused to meet with him. But then after the Little Blue in that, and once information got into Denver, I think it was about August 11th, the stagecoach came in, and the witnesses seeing the dead bodies on the road reported it, but there was a telegraph information that came in earlier than that, and Governor Evans issued his call for the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, of which my great-great-uncle served in Company G out of Pueblo. He testified under oath that he did not see any mutilations. It was not in that area of the battle where he was. He heard about it, and he disapproved of it. He said he did see some Indians that were scalped, and that's all he saw. But he condemned it. So anyway, a second proclamation was then sent out, also after the call for the 3rd Colorado, and Governor Evans now declared all adult Indians hostile, and you can kill them, you can take their property or whatever it is. And part of this was he had been trying for over a year to get soldiers back into Colorado. The 1st and 2nd Colorado Infantry, which was turned into cavalry later, were almost all of them sent out into Kansas and to the Civil War. And so he was trying to get more. They were isolated here and they needed help. So this, they wrote this letter, which we saw in instead of saying Gene and Cindy, I think the cousins work better. And you saw that letter that was written. And it was delivered to Wynkoop there at Fort Lyon. There's a Fort Lyon as was then, and you get a picture of Wynkoop there. And one of the persons who brought the letter was Eaglehead Mennonick. This is a picture of him in 1870. He came in with One Eye and One Eye's wife. One Eye was killed at the Sand Creek Massacre. Mennonick survived, but his wife and 2 daughters didn't. And so so here's this call for peace, and we see that he said that we have 7 prisoners. Actually, they had 8, and some of you may have read books that said that the other Indians had already been moved 200 miles away, because that's what Black Kettle said at this council with Governor Evans on September 27th. That's not true, because when those captives were rescued, including Lucinda, they said that they were under buffalo robes, ready to be stabbed if they said anything, when the soldiers were there negotiating with the Indians. The other lady was also there, and she did escape, and they brought her back and they hung her. She was Mrs. Snyder. And so you know this picture that was taken, and they were identified and stuff. But there's a little interesting story with the depredation claims before we get into Fletcher's. There's Margaret Cole's chief left hand. In her book, she has that picture. Oh, wait. What's going on? We got 4 pictures and 4 children in one and 3 in the other. And in the little credits under there, that picture was provided to Margaret Cole by the granddaughter of Laura Roper, the teenager in the picture. Well, when I got into the marble depredation claim, his father was killed in the Plum Creek Massacre. Danny was captured there. He never made it home. He got typhoid fever and died in November. And Laura Roper was released, and he was feeling better, and he thought he'd go home to his mom, and she went to Beatrice, and Mrs. Marble corresponded with her and said she learned that her husband had died, and Laura didn't know. In the depredation claim are 2 of Laura Roper's letters. And here's what she says. I received your letter yesterday and was very sorry to hear of the death of little Daniel. I was to see him the night before he left Denver, and the doctor said he thought he was out of danger. Dan wanted me to stay with him. He said that he would soon be well, and then he would go home and see his mother. Your husband was killed on Plum Creek, and he is buried there. He was not burnt. When she came back on the stagecoach, she saw that. He was not burned. I have a picture of all the children. I will see if I can get another taken from them. If I can't, I will cut Dan's face out and send it to you. I hate to cut the picture, but I will do it if I can't get another, for I know that you must feel very sad having lost him, yet it was from those Indians. Isn't that interesting? That also confirms who Danny Marble was, because Lewis Craft wants to insist in his writings that he changes the identity of the children. That's firsthand evidence there. Now here is that same picture of the Camp Weld Conference, and you see Wynkoop with a big hat on his leaning down in the middle. That's Black Kettle behind him. And to the right of Black Kettle, or our left as you're looking at the picture, that's Bull Bear. Bull Bear captured Danny Marble, and Mrs. Morton. Mrs. Morton's husband was killed. Mrs. Morton testified afterwards that she was captured by Bull Bear. And this is a more confirming evidence that the Southern Cheyenne were very actively involved. These were not peace chiefs coming in. These were chiefs that were at war, that came in and wanted to make peace over the winter and then go to war again in the summer. But of course, we had the Sand Creek Massacre on November 29th, and there's a lot of problems there because I've been reading the testimony, I've been studying that for a number of years. Shivington said 500 Indians was killed, but a sergeant under testimony said he counted and was ordered to count the dead bodies afterwards and counted 475. But Wynkoop was also sent out to investigate just weeks after the Sand Creek Massacre and took officers out, and in his report he said 67 dead Indians were on the battlefield, the majority of them women and children. So this is the only fight that we don't know what the statistics actually are. But among the victims were Mennonick's wife and 2 daughters. This is a marker of the Sand Creek Massacre site. It's actually not the right site. You see the trees in the way far over there. Is that called the foreground or the back? I get those backwards. That's where the village started. This monument was just cut out and destroyed and thrown away, I guess, because I had a picture of it sent by a person down in Lamar last week or recently. And of course, we know all about Julesburg and the attacks and the raids, and I talked about the Jim Moore story on one bus trip. And all of that's going on, and all of those Cheyenne are up there with that. But they had already confederated with everybody to go to war anyway. That's what the summer of '64 was about. That's why Sand Creek happened. And so they just continued this, but they had other motives, you know. I mean, if I lost my wife and 2 children, then I'd be ready to go to war and be a little more violent than I was before myself. So that's where it starts, and that's where the Indian raid happens with the Fletcher family. They had Mary Fletcher in the picture there was killed. Jasper Fletcher was severely wounded. A little bit about them. They came from Derbyshire, England in 1861. They stayed with friends they knew in England and in Indiana, and Illinois. And there, the final child was born, Elizabeth Lizzie Fletcher, on August 6, 1863. But included was 17-year-old Amanda Mary. She went with the mother's name, Mary, and 3 boys, 11, 6, and 4. And so they came out, and they actually first went to Denver. When they finally left Illinois, and they get out, and we're going to go to California. Well, let's check Denver out. They were in no hurry, you know. So they spent a couple weeks in Denver checking that out. Then they go up to Fort Laramie. And, you know, after the Sand Creek Massacre, the different forts held up all the freight wagons until there were enough wagons. And there was different orders at different times, at least 40 and sometimes as many as 100. And every wagon couldn't go until they had a caravan of at least 40, maybe 100, and then they'd arm every male on that caravan. So when they got into Fort Laramie, they were ready to send a caravan bringing supplies to Fort Douglas in Utah, and it was pulled by the slower moving oxen. And here's how prepared Jasper was for the travel on the trail. His wagon carrying the possessions was driven by 2 horses. You don't bring horses on the trail. and then a convenience wagon. That's the one with the umbrella over it, you know, for the girls to ride in, with 1 horse. So his whole stock was 3 horses. And of course, when the caravan leaves, every day they'd get miles in front of them. And then they'd stop and wait, like at lunchtime, and then they'd wait for the caravan to go. They'd eat their lunch and then rest, and then they'd go up and they'd be 4 or 5 miles in front of them. So camp time, and they'd come up and be like that. So this is good, and you know, we've said it several times here on this trip of no trees and stuff. So you could see the prairie. You could see large amounts of dust of wagons or enemies or buffalo on all that. So it's just clear day, it's nice, and so they're just going along, and they get about 80 miles following the Laramie River out of Fort Laramie, and not far from Fort Halleck, maybe 35 miles above where Laramie is today, somewhere in that area up there where Rock Creek Station was. They could see the activity of the Rock Creek Station, and they were way ahead of the caravan by about 3 miles, and they thought they'd go in for lunch. And while Jasper, I guess, was working on things on the wagon, the 3 girls, Lizzie and Mary and their mother, Mary, decided to walk up towards the Rock Creek Station crossing where there's a ferry, because they're going to get a ferry to get on the other side there. So but But when they come there, you know how things go down in the river valleys, and here come out 300 Cheyenne, and they catch the family there. Put a spear in the head of the mother, kills her instantly. They yank Lizzie from the arm of Mary. They hit Mary with a few arrows, she said, and she pulled them out, put her on a horse, and put Lizzie on a horse, and off they took. And Jasper was back at the wagons. They went to him, and when he saw what was happening 400 yards ahead, he told his boys to run back to the caravan, and they did. And so they came to him, and they wounded him critically in the arm, and he wasn't found for 2 days by another caravan who took him to Salt Lake City, and he died there in 1875. He never left Salt Lake City. The boys in the earlier caravan were taken to Salt Lake City, and then they realized that in meeting passing trains at some point going on the way to Salt Lake City, they exchanged the boys to go to Denver because there was an orphanage in Denver, and they thought the whole family was dead. So it was months before the boys were reunited with their father. It was almost 6 years before Mary Fletcher was reunited with her father. So that was the Rock Creek Crossing and where that happened. And then this is a picture of Mary. She said that she was holding her mother's hand and carrying Lizzie in the other when the Indians caught them. And of course, Mary was instantly killed. And Amanda Mary was taken captive, pulled onto a horse, and Lizzie was picked up and carried on another. Mary saw Lizzie later that day after that, but never saw her again. This is her a little bit later in life, but anyway, she was rescued. And she remained a captive until early February 1866, when a licensed Indian trader about 40 miles south of Dodge City was bringing annuities in to the Indians. And the Kiowa were a few miles away from the Arapaho, or a few miles away from the Cheyenne. There were about 4,000 warriors there, but they were there with their women and children too. And so Hanger was just 21 years old, but he was licensed to trade with the Indians, and he had $1,600 worth of goods. He gets her rescued. And the way he gets her rescued, it came like this. She was freckled and kind of red blonde hair, and they had her in Indian clothing, and every day they would paint her face red, and so that to hide her whiteness, and they would rub her and put ashes on her face, and then every few days they'd take her face and push it into the coal fires, you know, the fire of the coals, to burn her face dark. And so when and then she went through all kinds of ordeals that I talk about in the book, but that's just one. But she, when traders would come, they'd first have a celebration, and the traders would bring the flour into that. The Indians loved pancakes. They called them flapjacks, and Mary knew how to make them. So she was ordered to make flapjacks. And so she came into the tent or wherever it was where Charles Hanger was and asked for soap. And an Indian warrior immediately knocked her down and drug her out and all that. But that got the word out, because as Charles Hanger testified, he thought it was an Indian until she spoke. And then when the word was out, then they let her talk to him. And he said he'd do anything he could, you know, to get the flapjacks and all that. Anything that he could to get her rescued. And he traded all his goods, all of it, to the Indians to get her, got her rescued. And she ended up at Fort Larned and ended up with family friends back in Illinois, and there then married a man a year later and had 4 children with him. Well, while she was in captivity, the 7th Cavalry was being formed in 1866, and Jasper Fletcher starts writing to Custer at Fort Riley about his family, his 2 daughters. And when Mary gets rescued, she does too. And she's trying to find Lizzie. She figures her father's dead. She doesn't know what happened to her sons or anything. And she has no idea where they are. And Custer in 1874 published this book, My Life on the Plains. And in the chapter in there, he's got about them writing her. And just put a little bit in bold that I have there. I have received several letters from the father and eldest daughter and from friends of both requesting me to obtain the release of the little girl if possible. And they learned that she was in a camp by an Indian chief named Cutnose. was located on the Smoky Hill River, not far from Monument Station. He frequently visited the stage stations for purposes of trade and was invariably accompanied by his little captive. And down at the bottom, he appeared to treat her with great affection and always kept her clothed in the handsomest of Indian garments. All offers from individuals to ransom her proved unavailing. Although she has been with the Indians but a year, so he's writing this in 1867, she spoke the Cheyenne language fluently and seemed to have no knowledge of her mother tongue. By the way, the three boys stayed in Salt Lake City, and they converted to Mormonism, and there is one family still there today where I found the descendants, and they're active Mormons. So they made a monument in one of the cemeteries in Salt Lake City with a Fletcher there. Neither one's, Jasper's buried there. As Mary said, when she met her father in 1871, that he was not the man he was from his losses and all that. And he just fell dead on the streets of Salt Lake City in 1875. So George Bent, Cody started his Wild West show, and one of his first little scenes was the capture of Lizzie Fletcher. And so Mary learns about that and writes Cody, and Cody writes her back and says, the guy that wrote the story doesn't know anything about it. He picked that name up. And so, but he suggested that he contact George Bent. And so Bent talks about also Mary Fletcher writing her. And he said, she told me that despite reports to the contrary, she was well treated by her captors. Really? This is what Mary said. As for telling my experience with the Indians, I cannot convey the language that would convey the remotest idea to one not experiencing it. Of the freezing cold, sleet and rain, and the torture I would receive from these Indians. I ought to say fiends. Yes, they were far worse than any name I could give them. If I could have my way, there would not be one left alive. I've been almost starved days at a time without one morsel to eat. Oh, how I prayed for death to come to my relief. Now, in my book, I have many, many more of her testimony about what she endured. But that one is pretty good. But she did something that I really appreciated. Because as you're reading this right now, you think this is what she thinks of all Indians, right? No, she makes a distinction. I wish to state in this connection that the main tribe or band of Cheyennes was also peaceable. It was only a small band of Cheyennes, comparatively speaking, that were committing these depredations, and to distinguish them from the peaceable Cheyennes, they were known at that time as the Cheyenne Dog Soldiers. That's who she had no compassion for. So you think it's the end of the story, right? First, let's look here on a little map. You can see the Wind River Reservation up in here. But Casper is about 125 miles east of the reservation. And that's where the railroad was. So about in August of 1900, they came down for their annuities that come in on the railroad. So about 40 men came down, 40 warriors, old warriors, came down to load up the annuities, and they brought down about 20 or 25 of their women. And they were trading trinkets to the Casper citizens while the men were loading that. And they noted that one of the Indians trading was clearly white but couldn't speak any English. So they asked a reporter asked one of the older men who she might be, and he said, we captured her 35 years ago. That's 1865. That hit the national press. And when it got into Salt Lake City, one of the brothers mailed a copy to Mary in Davenport, Iowa, where she raised her family. And so Mary began a correspondence with Agent Nickerson at the Wind River Reservation saying, I think this might be my sister. In her correspondence, she mentions that her sister had a distinctive birthmark, so she could tell from that. She didn't visit for 2 years. In 1902, she came out, and she was escorted up there. And with Agent Nickerson, she met her sister's husband, and an interpreter. But when her sister learned of her white heritage, her reply through the interpreter is, I have no memory of this, and I will make my teepee and my life with my husband, and I will not go back with you. This devastated Mary. As you could think, for 37 years. Lizzie turned 2 1 week after she was captured, July 31st. And you know, the kids are so cute then. And Mary was 17. Mary misrepresented her age as 13 on all the depredation claims. But in Jasper Fletcher's first depredation claim, when they were missing, he said she was 17. And when she finally died in 1928, the truth came out that she was born 17 years before she was captured. But it didn't matter if she was 13, because we have records in the German family that the 12-year-old Sophia German was raped repeatedly during her captivity, and we have also Indian depredation claims of 13-year-olds repeatedly raped. There's a picture of Lizzie actually standing in the door. She's probably about 39, 40, something like that. And it was, Lizzie's name was Kels Two Brokenhorn, and after she met with her sister, she changed her name to Lizzie Brokenhorn. She liked the story. She liked knowing her white background. This schoolhouse is still there. It has been moved. It's at the cemetery where Sacagawea is buried. And when I was there on that tour, and I said, my gosh, that's that same house. And it is. When you look at it, I counted the slats on the left. You see a much higher roof that's been cut off, and you see that they cut the slats off on the corners and put them up like that. That's that same schoolhouse that picture was taken in. Now, I'm almost done. In 1923, there were two movies that came out where they employed about 75 Indians from the Wind River Reservation, and they stayed several weeks in the California area, made appearances and stuff. And they appeared in The Covered Wagon and The Iron Horse. However, I just watched both movies again shortly before I came here. You can get them on Amazon for about $15. Oh, and by the way, notice on The Iron Horse, do you see the producer in that? A John Ford production. That's the trilogy, you know, with John Wayne and the Searchers and all that. And she wore a yellow ribbon. So he was in production for a long time. But the star, apparently, was Lizzie. That's her husband on the right, and that's supposedly Lizzie on the left. But without question, we got them together here, huh? You see Lizzie? With John Brokenhorn. And look at the beadwork on her. What the citizens said, that this white woman's beadwork was superior to the other Indians. That's not something that the Indians like to hear, you know. They didn't like Dances with Wolves because Kevin Costner was superior to teach them how to hunt buffalo better, you know, and stuff like that. And, you know, with good reasons. But that beadwork is just exquisite. And so she became known. She actually moved closer to the roads and travel so that people could come by and buy trinkets from her for about 20 years. And her husband became a prosperous horse trader and all that. He too was of a higher plane than the other Indians, of his fellow men. They lived the rest of their lives in a small cabin about a half a mile from the St. Stephen's Mission, where I spent 5 days this summer at the reservation. Lizzie died in 1927, 8 months before Mary died. Mary died of pretty much a broken heart. You know, you can see him there. When Mary's obituary, this is interesting. In later years, Mrs. Cook, just because she married Cook, kept up a constant search for her little sister. At one time, she thought she had located the missing woman who was supposed to be living among the Indians and refused to leave them to return to civilization. However, no absolute proof was ever established that it was the sister of Mrs. Cook. Well, you know, that birthmark sure established it for Lizzie, didn't it? And what do you do when you have a broken heart like that? So now you know the rest of the story. Thank you.